My name is Peter Snow, and I'm a member of the steering committee at the Out of the Cold program in Georgetown, Ontario. Welcome to Mental Health Support and De-escalation video number 4. In our first 3 videos, we covered topics such as the basics of mental health support, how to practice mental health support, and how to handle a panic attack. Today we're going to be discussing suicide and suicidal thoughts. Now this is a very intense topic and can be really difficult for some people to discuss. I'd recommend you take a moment now, check in on yourself, and make sure you're prepared to have this conversation. If not, that's okay. Go away, take some time, and come back to it when you feel ready. But if you're prepared, come along with me, and we'll discuss how this topic affects the people who frequent our program. So every day in Canada, somewhere between 11 to 13 people die by suicide. And in fact, these numbers have been fairly steady for many years. There was a slight uptick over the last decade or so, but we're still well within that range. We know that certain groups, such as Indigenous people, have higher rates of suicide, and there are many factors that increase people's risk of contemplating and attempting suicide. And suicidal thoughts are fairly common. Somewhere around 12% of Canadians experience suicidal thoughts at some point in their lives. Somewhere around 4% will come up with a plan, and around 3% will make an attempt. These numbers may seem high to you or they may seem low to you. Regardless, it's important to recognize that the people that we serve in our program are at potentially a 10 times higher risk than the general population. A 2012 study looked at the suicide rates among homeless, and it recognized that they have a much more significant risk of attempting suicide than anyone else in the general population. And in fact, more than half of the people experiencing homelessness have had thoughts of suicide or have made a suicide attempt in their life. I thank the National Healthcare for the Homeless Council for that information. So when we talk about suicidal thoughts and we talk about suicide, what are we actually talking about? So a suicidal thought can take many forms. It can look at the thought of, I don't want to be here anymore, or I'm tired of dealing with this. It can be, I really wish I was dead. I wish I could die. I want to die. I need to find a way to die. And many other versions of that. Often when people approach their lives, they look at suicide as the exit door. It's the emergency exit. It's the way to get out of the situation that you're in. And it might be actually helpful to talk a little bit more about the function of a suicidal thought. What is its purpose and why is it there? I think as a society, we tend to look at suicidal thoughts as being completely irrational and make no sense. And if you're someone who's never experienced a suicidal thought, it can definitely feel that way. But if you have had one before, and I myself have, you can start to understand and recognize that it exists in this kind of strange rationality. That there is a problem that I don't know how to fix. And one way I could fix it is by not being here anymore. The problem would be solved. Now there can be very many more factors that impact and influence the experience or the appearance of a suicidal thought. And in many cases, at the root of it is a problem that I can't deal with. Whether it's an emotion, a feeling, a situation, it doesn't matter. It could be anything. It's also important to remember that if our guests are coming to us and telling us that they're having these thoughts or these feelings, it demonstrates that they trust us, and it very likely demonstrates that they still have hope that they're not actually going to die by suicide. It doesn't mean we shouldn't take what they're saying seriously. We absolutely should, every single time. It also means that we know that they still have something there that's causing them to reach out to people and tell them what's going on. I would also like to mention, along with those stats we talked about earlier with the homeless population, the rates of mental health issues among the homeless are much higher. And often many of these people have been institutionalized or have had experiences of institutions where they've received very specific reactions to expressing suicidal thoughts. And I want to be very clear from the outset that if someone is actively suicidal in our program, it is our obligation and our duty to engage emergency services to get the support that that person requires. And I also want to be clear that that isn't a happy ending all of the time. Emergency services for suicide in our society are not fantastic, but they do exist, and they can help people, if in no other way than keeping them alive. Your greatest ally when dealing with someone who's feeling suicidal is time. The longer you can keep them going, you can keep them, attached to this world, the more chance there is for that emotion, that thought to de-escalate and come down. So how do we do that? Well, first let's talk about the warning signs. How do we know that someone's experiencing this if they're not just coming up and saying directly, I want to kill myself? Because they often won't say that. They may. They often won't. So if someone talks about, I really wish I was dead, I want to die, or, it would be just easier if I killed myself. Obviously, those are clear warning signs. Even something as innocuous as I don't want to be here anymore can be a sign. Now, of course, there are many interpretations of that phrase, but that's where our listening and validation and understanding comes in, and that curiosity. They may look for a way to do it. You may notice them looking for things that potentially could end their life. That could be trying to find something they could tie around their neck, or, often we'll see people sort of wandering around outside into traffic and things like that. It may not be obvious to us that that's what's going on, but there may be a sign there too. They may talk about feeling hopeless or having no purpose in life. They may talk about feeling trapped or being in this unbearable pain that they can't get out of. They may talk about being a burden to other people. In our program, talking to volunteers about, I'm just burdening you, I don't want to be a burden to you, can sometimes be a sign that they're considering suicide. They may increase their use of drugs or alcohol to try and cope with those feelings, make them go away. They may seem more anxious, agitated, or behave more recklessly in their life. They may be sleeping more or sleeping less than they normally do. They may start to withdraw. They may express a feeling of isolation. They might get really angry. They might talk about getting revenge on people or getting back at people. They might also have really strong mood swings, up and down and around and around. Any one of these things on its own may not be problematic or a warning sign, but as we start to unravel and find more and more of these things in someone, it's very likely that at least the idea is there. I'm going to link a video in the description by Kevin Hines. Now, Kevin Hines is a man who attempted suicide by jumping off the Golden Gate Bridge in San Francisco. And he miraculously survived that. Most people don't survive jumping off that bridge. And he talks about his experience. And what I think is really valuable in that, one is the sort of hope he talks about and the idea of, as soon as he jumped, he realized it wasn't the right decision for him. I think it's also important to just listen to him talk about the experience he had before that moment, how he felt, what he went through, how he got to that point. Because if you're not someone who's ever experienced these kinds of thoughts or feelings, it can help you to empathize and understand what that's like. So, what do we do if we're concerned that someone might be suicidal? If someone has expressed a thought or feeling. We're going to keep listening to that person. We're going to validate their feelings. Now let's talk about validation in suicide, because this is really important. We are not going to validate the idea that they should die or that they want to kill themselves. That falls under our don't validate the invalid. Because although people are free to make their own choices and decisions about their lives, and attempting suicide is not a crime, it's not something that we treat as if it's wrong in a sense, it's also not a thought we want to validate. Because although that person may feel that way, and we can acknowledge that they feel that way, like I can understand that you're feeling like you want to die. I can understand that you want to kill yourself. We can validate that. We don't want to validate that that would be the solution to the problem they're dealing with, right? So we want to be very clear about that. We want to say, I can understand, how you'd feel like you want to die because you're feeling really hopeless about everything that's going on in your life right now. And I also understand that we're talking And we're having this conversation right now. And it's really important to me that you were willing to share that and have this conversation with me. Quick note, I'm using the word and. When we're validating, we don't use the word but. So I don't say, I can understand that you want to die and you're feeling hopeless, but it's really important that you're talking to me right now. Because when I use that word but, I immediately erase all the stuff I said before that. That person just hears that but and they hear what happens after it. So we want to avoid that. We want to stick with and. Let's string thoughts together with and. So two things can be true at the same time. We're going to ask questions and we're going to be specific. We're going to name the thing. And this is often the hardest part for people. People want to dance around the bush. They want to say, are you thinking of hurting yourself? Are you thinking of harming yourself? Are you thinking of doing something? No, we don't want to do that. We don't want to be vague. We want to be specific. We want to say, are you thinking about killing yourself? Are you having thoughts about suicide? Are these thoughts related to suicide? We want to be specific and clear so that we know what's going on and so that the person knows we know what's going on. Because they may not be thinking about suicide, but they might be thinking of hurting themselves, right? They might be like, oh, I'm going to go do something that's going to hurt me, some kind of self-harm behavior or some kind of reckless behavior, right? That's going to be damaging to me in a different way. But it might not be suicide. But we need to know if it is. We need to know what it is. And as soon as possible, when we're concerned and we know that suicide might be on the table, we're going to alert the other people that we're working with. We need those other volunteers to know so they can start to mobilize, to support us and to support our guests. And if that person gives us an indication, even a small indication, any amount of indication that they're thinking about attempting suicide, then we're going to contact emergency services. Going back to our very first video, we're not professionals. Our job is not to treat, counsel, or therapize anybody. Our job is to assess the situation and take appropriate steps. And the appropriate steps, if we think someone is actively thinking about trying to kill themselves, is to contact emergency services and let them deal with it. So once again, we're going to listen to the person. We're going to validate what they're feeling. We're not going to validate their desire to attempt suicide and say that that's a great idea. Something, yeah, absolutely. We're going to say, I can understand you feel that way. I can see how you might feel hopeless. Or you might feel lost or like there's no solution. And then we're going to validate that they're talking to us and that that relationship is important. We're going to ask specific questions about suicide. We're going to ask, are you having thoughts of suicide? Are you thinking about killing yourself? As soon as possible, we're going to alert the volunteers around us. And if that person indicates in any way that they're thinking of attempting suicide, we're going to contact emergency services. We're going to work with them, and we're going to get that person the support that they need to stay alive. So while we're doing all of that, there are some important considerations. One, we need to remain as calm as possible. Remember what I've said about checking in with yourself at the beginning of your shift. Notice how you're feeling, what you're experiencing, seeing what kind of headspace you're in. That's really important in these situations when you need to remain calm so that you can support this person. You're not going to invalidate their experience. You're not going to try to talk them out of it. You're not going to say, oh, but what about all the things you have to live for? What about this and what about that? No. We're going to be non-judgmental. We are, however, going to ask lots of questions, very clearly, as I've noted, very confidently, and we're going to ask them about alternatives. And we're going to talk about what alternatives might be. Not to talk them out of it, but just to show them that there's a path, We can ask them, have you felt this way before? And when you felt this way, what did you do? Like, how did you deal with it? What was helpful? What could help you get through this kind of feeling? And we're going to validate, and we're going to validate, and we're going to validate, and we're going to validate. Very importantly within that validation, we're going to make sure they understand that we know that feeling suicidal is distressing. It's very difficult to feel suicidal. And I just want to repeat the validation piece one more time because it's so important. We're going to avoid validating that plan to end their life. We're going to validate their underlying feelings. We're going to validate how difficult it is to feel like that and that it's really distressing to be suicidal. And we're also going to tell them that we appreciate that they're talking to us and that we are here. That's why we're here. We're listening. Now, if you go ahead and take something like mental health first aid, you're going to learn a lot more about doing this. Or if you go to assist, you'll learn a lot more about doing this. Take some further steps. Mental health first aid talks about the algae model, which is assess for risk of suicide or harm, listen non-judgmentally, give reassurance and information, encourage appropriate professional help, and encourage self-help and other support strategies, very similar to what we've been talking about. You can go to their website. It's in the description. Learn a lot more about this model and look into training if that's something you want to pursue, and I would recommend taking additional training for sure. So let's talk a little bit more about that assessing risk part. Because we've talked about, okay, you've talked to the person, you validated them, you need to figure out whether this person needs emergency services. So we talked about the steps. Listening, validating, activating emergency services when we need. But how do we actually assess the risk? We're not expecting you to be able to decide if someone is at risk of suicide. This evaluation has to be collaborative between the guest and all of the volunteers. We need to work together on this decision. And many people will experience thoughts of suicide without any intention of acting on them. You know, and people with existing mental health issues may often have suicidal thoughts. Some people have them every day. It's just part of their day-to-day. So when we're assessing risk, we're looking at what is the actual danger here. And our threshold is going to be pretty low because we're not professionals. So how do we do that? Well, we go back to our warning signs. We listen to what they're saying to us about the situation. Wanting to die or kill themselves, looking for ways to kill themselves, talking about hopelessness or having no purpose, being trapped, being in unbearable pain, being a burden to others. These are all the kind of things we're going to look for. We're also going to notice things they might have said or done while they were with us. Perhaps they mentioned using more drugs or alcohol recently. Perhaps they're acting sort of anxious or agitated or maybe doing things recklessly. Maybe they're not sleeping very much or sleeping a lot. Maybe they're withdrawing or feeling isolated. Maybe they're being really angry or talking about revenge they want to get. Perhaps their mood is all over the place. Now, going back to our very first video when we talked about rapport, this is where that rapport comes in handy because not only are you going to have a good relationship where this person's going to trust you, you're going to know them a bit. And you're going to be able to observe over time how they change and grow and things that happen with them. So you're going to have a sense of like these changes when they're happening. So when we're assessing risk, we're also going to ask that question that I mentioned. We're going to be really calm and really clear, and we're going to say, have things gotten so bad that you're thinking about killing yourself or ending your life? Or we may say something like, you know, sometimes when people feel the way that you do right now, they start to think about suicide. Is this happening to you? Like, are you thinking about suicide? And it's okay to ask those questions. For one, many of our guests will have been asked these questions before, so they're used to them. But even if they haven't, asking someone if they're okay is a really kind thing to do. So don't be afraid to ask. The worst that can happen is they can say, no, I'm not feeling that way. Why would you think that? And they may get a little upset. And that's okay, because you can use your validation skills to say, no, I was just curious because I wanted to make sure you were okay. And I can understand why that might upset you, that I might make that assumption. And if you have to apologize, you apologize. And that's okay. So now that we've assessed the risk, we've asked the question, and we've gotten an affirmative answer that they're thinking about suicide, we validate their emotions, we ask if they feel safe, we ask them what helps them to feel better or feel safer. We're not going to argue with them about it. We're not going to debate them. We're not going to tell them, think about your family or think about the people that care about you or how could you do this to us? Things that people do say in those situations because they're panicked. Don't list off all the reasons why they shouldn't kill themselves. Let them know that you're going to share that information with the other people that are volunteering there. That's an expectation that you have to do that. And then once you inform others, continue to provide that support. Now, if the situation resolves, if they're not actively thinking of attempting suicide, then you're going to connect with the other volunteers and debrief, right? And you're going to connect with people from the program, a steering committee, to debrief, to talk it through if that's going to be helpful for you. You're also going to check into yourself because it can be really emotionally draining to have that conversation with somebody. I've had those conversations hundreds of times in my life, and it's still not the most pleasant experience. So it's important to be prepared to check in. And remember that you're going to do the best that you can. And that person is in control of their own life. It's entirely possible that someone can come to our program feeling suicidal, wanting to attempt suicide, and not say a word to anyone about it. And they're allowed to do that. It's their life. We can't control that. We can only control doing the best that we can do, following the steps that we know to follow, engaging the services we need to engage when it's the appropriate time. So in summary, you are not alone. Rely on the team of volunteers around you and all the outside supports that are available when they're necessary to help you. Remain calm and ask questions. Be specific and clear and confident with that person. You're going to listen, assess, reassure them that you're there, encourage the help that will be useful for that person, encourage them to use self-help, encourage them to use other strategies, help them find ways to feel better. And for the final time, if you believe that someone is going to attempt to kill themselves, you are calling 911. If you have any further questions about mental health support or de-escalation, you can talk to Reverend Booz or myself. We'll be happy to support you and give you more information. And once again, I suggest if you want to learn more about this topic, you can take additional trainings from organizations such as Mental Health First Aid or Assist that can teach you a great deal more detail and specific approaches and techniques to help with assessing and intervening with suicidal thoughts. Thank you, and I'll see you in our next and final video.